Welcome to the Intern Corner, everybody. First Intern Corner post-coup on the Capitol. And while it was immensely frustrating to see the police treat these people with nice little soft gloves, at least we can rest assured that almost nobody's going to be held accountable for it. And speaking of accountability, today we're going to investigate why the internet hates Paul George so much. How's that for a transition? Paul George is an internet clown, and in his free time, an NBA basketball player. He is one of the most highly paid players in the league. He's a multi-time All-Star, a former MVP candidate, goes by many a moniker, from Playoff P to Pandemic P. And overall, he is a bit of a disaster. The internet, they seem to loathe this man, and our podcast has been known to pile onto that. Though it was weird for me to think about because Paul George was not always this way. People used to love Paul George. At least they admired him and some of the efforts he put on, especially in Indiana. So I wanted to look into what exactly happened that made everyone turn on this very goofy, lanky, smooth shooting man. So a little background, I guess, on Paul George. I mean, back in Indiana, he was a pretty well-liked star, a homegrown star for a small market team who had some really competitive playoff runs against LeBron's Heatles even. And then in 2014, he had a really gruesome leg injury in USA basketball, which everyone felt really terrible for him for. And then eventually he was able to come back from that and basically be back to the Paul George we knew before. And it was something that everyone really celebrated, and they were really happy for him, and they were like, hell yeah, like this guy, he put it back together after a really traumatic injury, and everyone was like, way to go, buddy, like, congratulations, we love Paul George. Then things took a turn. The Pacers kind of fell apart. They got rid of key members of their team, didn't sit well with anybody. Paul George eventually decides to ask for a trade. Something that doesn't usually sit well with small market teams. Especially their fans. But he asked for a trade. Kevin Durant, around that time, went to the Warriors. And so the Pacers shipped Paul George out to the Oklahoma City Thunder. And those Pacers fans immediately turned on him because, like I said, small market teams don't really take kindly to their homegrown stars leaving them. See the Oklahoma City Thunder. So the bubbles of this hate were starting to brew. His first year in OKC was pretty uneventful and unremarkable, and it ended with a really embarrassing playoff exit for that team. That was the year they had Melo there, and it was just overall not a successful run. And so the summer after that, Paul George entered free agency, at which point he decided, I think it's time that the people hear from Paul George directly. I'm going to have a multi-part documentary series about my free agency journey, and the people are going to love it. But people did not love it. Paul George re-signed with OKC on a big multi-year deal. He was like, hell yeah, guys, I'm here, I'm staying, I went to Russ's barbecue, it was great, I'm ready to go. It was huge for a fan base that had just so recently lost their megastar in Kevin Durant, similar lanky, smooth shooting goober. And so this was kind of big for OKC, especially their fans. But it definitely did not sit well with the many NBA fans who, for some reason, could not possibly fathom a famous person engaging in self-aggrandizing behavior. Many people thought he would go to the Lakers. He'd always been wanting to go to LA, team up with LeBron, all that stuff, and it just didn't happen. And people were like, well, whatever, Paul George, you're a loser. We don't care about you. You're a loser and a coward. Like a coward and a loser, Paul George. You got nothing. You don't even deserve to be on a team with LeBron James, you coward and loser. And so he took that and had the greatest season of his career the very next year. Averaged about 28 points a game, was an MVP candidate. His shoulders stopped working towards the end of the year and everything fell apart. It was a classic Paul George story. And that was actually, I think, the year, unless it was the year before, when Paul George gave himself the nickname Playoff P and then proceeded to playoff piss his pants and lose in the first round again. So that's a lesson to everyone, basically. Never give yourself a nickname unless you're Kobe Bryant, because people are going to be merciless to you. So after a terrible playoff exit, Paul George did what Paul George does best, demanded a trade to supposedly greener pastures in Los Angeles, but this time for the Clippers. Now, Paul George and the Clippers are kind of a beautiful symbiotic match here, in the sense that they're both very unserious and prone to dramatic failure. So this was kind of a match made in heaven. Paul George leaving OKC assured them a bright young future with tons of picks. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Danilo Gallinari. It was a big coup for OKC. All the while, Paul George was sitting there looking at the Clippers saying, "Hey baby, the future's not real, baby. We only got tonight, baby. Think of tonight, baby. There is no tomorrow, baby. I love you, baby. It's you and me, baby." At which point he proceeded to take part in one of the most toxic campaigns of any supposed juggernaut team in recent NBA history. The Clippers completely collapsed in the bubble, as did, of course, Paul George, losing a 3-1 series to the Nuggets right before the Western Conference Finals, at which point Paul George gave a locker room speech that was so terrible it essentially sent Montrezl Harrell to the Lakers the next year. People did not like Paul George on this team, which kind of reaffirmed that the internet might not have been so wrong for hating on Paul George all this time. But, as with anything, the internet, not a place to look for nuance. Paul George is not a terrible player, but he is one prone to high-profile disasters. So after all his hard work, he signed a max extension, one of the biggest contracts in history with the Clippers, which, of course, NBA fans took very well and maturely, and they were happy for him to get his bag, and they were like, "Way to go, Paul George." And we're really pumped for you, Paul George. You worked really hard for this, and you deserve this. Way to go, Paul George. And now we're up to this year, where he has proceeded to flip-flop between making everyone eat their words and then getting served a fresh new plate of their words. Paul George continues to just baffle the league with his inconsistency. He's someone who will show up and look dominant, because that's the thing, is he looks really good when he plays basketball, but then sometimes it's just a disaster for seemingly no reason. And it's gotten to a point where no one really respects this guy. Even Devin Booker called him soft in a game this year. And that's Devin Booker, the "please don't double team me" guy. Like, if that guy's calling you soft, like, you're in bad company, Paul George. But look, at the end of the day, Paul George is a very good player. He's just frustratingly inconsistent. And this is the kind of thing that fans like to pile onto, especially when you're supposed to be a star. If you're going to be in the profile that Paul George wants to put himself in, you have to deliver almost every single night. You cannot have these failures that Paul George continues to have, especially without the successes to back it up. This is all kind of the background of what led everyone, including this very podcast, to hate Paul George so much. Dude's a goober, but I do hope that he can turn it around, because Paul George was once very likable and exciting, and I think that maybe he could be that again. But if not, we'll continue getting off these jokes, baby. Thank you for watching today's Intern Corner. It's been a heck of an Intern Corner, if I do say so myself. My brain's a little rattled, just from the very public acts of treason the other day. But hey, we still gotta pump out that content, baby. So here I am, and here you are. So why don't you give us a little like, give us a little subscribe, subscribe to the podcast. Show some love, folks, or hate. I mean, clicks are clicks. That's the way the news goes, folks. So that's all I got for you, and See you next week.